All right, so I think we can all agree that it's been a really important morning, a really informative morning, and I am very grateful to Torah in Motion. This is my first time coming here, and it's been incredible. And anytime, my pleasure. It's a wonderful organization, wonderful people, and it's really a tremendous honor. Thank you. So my talks are kind of all been structured, thank you, around addiction, codependency. Now we're going to do sex addiction. There's going to be a talk of a kind of a personal thing tonight, and then resiliency tomorrow, and then how to reduce stigma. So everything, and I organized it around addiction. So just, caveat, mTOR, is that what they say? Buyer beware. This is a talk on sex addiction. So if you are sensitive and you don't want to hear certain things, which I completely understand is your choice, then, don't listen. It's not pleasant, but it is necessary. And I know I'm speaking to a lot of people who are in the medical field. So, but you'd be surprised. You'd really be surprised about people's squeamishness when it comes to this subject. Okay, so the topic of this talk is called Addictions That Are Hard to Talk About, and can we shed some light? And so one of the main objectives is to really kind of understand what sex addiction is and compulsive sexual behavior. We're going to talk about two different types of sex addiction. We're going to talk about the relationship between sex addiction, childhood trauma, and also attachment theory. And then we're going to talk about the prevalence and the power of internet pornography. All right. So just want to finish my preface by saying I'm 3/4 of a way done from what we call a CSAT, which is a certified sex addiction therapist. There are 4 modules. I completed 3. It's through an organization called ITAP, International Institute for Trauma Addiction Professionals, started by Dr. Patrick Carnes. Dr. Patrick Carnes is to sex addiction kind of like what Rabbi Twersky was to regular addiction. He wrote his first book in the 1980s called Out of the Shadows, where he introduces the concepts of sex addiction. Dr. Carnes is himself a recovering sex addict. He has a rehab center, a very good one in Arizona. He's created this institute. They do research. The presenters for this course have been absolutely phenomenal. So I really am saying it, if anybody here does do some mental health or even in their own practice or work, it's really a very, very worthwhile course to take. So, okay. So in January of 2020, the ICD-11 accepted sexual compulsion as a diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. DSM just lists compulsive sexual behavior, but they won't list sex addiction. So you can bill for it, but we can't write about it. So it's defined by very similar to substance abuse and addiction. And this is where we kind of have to start the discussion. You talk to people about sex addiction and they're like, okay, like what's the problem? Like people like to have sex, what's going on here? And people giggle and they get squeamish and like, oh, this is not an issue. And what does it really mean? So for example, a person engages in sexual activity at the expense of other areas of their life. They attempt to control it. They continue to do it despite negative consequences. They engage in the behavior, although it provides very little pleasure. Recovery from sex addiction is going to mimic recovery from substance abuse. Early recovery from any type of addiction, whether it's chemical or behavioral, early recovery is 3 to 5 years. Not 3 to 5 days, 3 to 5 weeks, 3 to 5 months, it's 3 to 5 years. When you recover from addiction, I tell my clients, it's not like taking a Z-Pack. You swallow a couple of Zithromax, 2 days later, you feel better, you move on with your life. It takes about a year and a half from chemical, alcohol, and behavioral addiction like sex addiction for the brain to just start to undergo some changes, literally to kind of like dry out. As the person with the addiction gets a sponsor and works a step, their thinking starts to change. And it's the 12 steps, and it's when they kind of reach step 4. Step 4 is when the thinking starts to shift. Takes people about 2 years to get through the steps, the meetings. So you're looking at a long process. That kind of links into what we talked about before. If you are involved with a family member or a partner, really take care of yourself and get into your own recovery process because it can be and is exhausting. All right. What makes sex addiction addiction? Well, number one, it's the obsession. Number two, it's the loss of control. You simply lose control over what it is that you're doing. There are always going to be direct, repeated negative consequences, just like we see in chemical addiction. You can have relationship problems. You can have issues at work or in school. You could have physical health issues. You can be depressed or have anxiety, low self-esteem. There can be major financial difficulties, and you lose interest in all of your other previously enjoyable activities, and there is legal trouble. I have to say, at this point in my practice, I think I see and treat more people with sex addiction than substance addiction. There's definitely been a shift. We have a lot of sex addiction in our community. And if living with chemical addiction or alcoholism is painful and stigmatizing, sex addiction is just absolutely devastating for people. Many of my clients are leading double lives. They kind of are involved in the community, they walk the walk, they talk the talk, but they are tormented because they have active sex addiction and their marriages are a mess. They have no idea how to say anything to their partners. There is more than one or two or three, or I don't know how many children walking around as one of the consequences of sex addiction from many of my clients. And things can get really hard. With addiction, the person that has the addiction has to hit what we call the bottom. And that's kind of the behavior reaches a level where the consequences are bad. I always pray that my clients hit a bottom that will jar them into recovery, but not bad enough that it will hurt them, kill somebody else, or land them in jail for a considerable amount of time. I did have association with one couple, very, very, very religious couple, and she went to the doctor for an annual visit. The doctor called her back and said, "You need to come in." She did. He said, "Look, there's a problem." She's like, "What's the problem?" And the doctor said, "You have HPV." She's like, "What's that?" And the doctor put his hand on her shoulder and said, "Look, it's confidential in here. I won't tell anybody." And she said, "Tell anybody what?" And he said, "You have HPV." She's like, "Well, what is that?" And he said, "It's a sexually transmitted disease." And she said, "But I got married at 18 and I've never been with anybody but my husband." And the doctor just nodded and the light bulb kind of went off in her brain. Her husband had contracted HPV, gave it to her. She began to have signs of cervical cancer. She had to have a portion of her cervix removed. So what happened to them? Well, spoiler alert, they actually have one of the best marriages I've ever seen in my life. They stripped it down to the bare bones. They both got into recovery. They're an incredible couple. She had several children afterwards, and they really made it. So there is hope. There definitely is hope. All addictions, by definition of them being an addiction, is about escaping reality. People that self-medicate with substances or behavior, as we've been discussing all morning, are looking to soothe very, very painful feelings and escape reality. But there's no addictive substance here. So it's an interesting thing that people that have sex addiction particularly get high more on the fantasy and the ritual of obtaining the sex. All addiction is rooted in fantasy. Sex addiction is very rooted. That is the basis of the addiction. It's not the act itself. It's the buildup to the act and what the mind does with the act and the preparing for it and the seeking it out and the getting it. Once the individual gets with the partner and they have sex and they have an orgasm, the crash comes and you start all over again. That's the similarity to that and chemical addiction. By the way, I'm going to make this interactive because I just think like this is a subject that if people want to ask questions or see, I knew that. Go ahead.
I just was making a push for everybody to get Gardasil.
Oh,
In our communities, the principals do not advocate for that, and many.
So I'm pretty sure in the United States, and I may be wrong, the American Academy of Pediatrics, it's vaccinates kids as young as 10 with Gardasil. And I think it's required.
It's generally not, my experiences that the Orthodox community is generally not accepting of the vaccine because their children will be virgins at the time of marriage and they don't expect,
Yeah, I very much think it should be given because the vast majority of those kids will not be virgins when they get married. And the parents are not going to know, and it is a transmittable disease. And just kind of saying, this is very interesting. I'm on a listserv. I'm on a lot of listservs, and one of the listservs, it was a Nefesh listserv actually, and I don't remember the practitioner's name, but he put up there that he's treating a guy who is in recovery for sex addiction, and he does have HPV, and he's dating, and he wanted to know if he should disclose it to the person he's dating. And the practitioner wrote, I told him, I don't really think it was necessary, and I messaged the practitioner. I said, call me privately. And I just left my number and I had him call me. He really had no idea what HPV is and what it could do to a woman. And I said, it's the number one disease that can cause cervical cancer in women, which is the very leading cause of death in cancers for women. It can really cause a lot of issues. He honestly did not know. And I said, you really have to do your research. Your client absolutely has to disclose this to a potential partner. That's unconscionable to marry somebody having HPV and not to tell them. It's absolutely horrible. And it kind of again goes to what Dr. Friedman has been talking about all morning. There is a huge, huge, huge need to educate practitioners, people, because they don't know. I don't think this practitioner was malicious in any way. I think he was uninformed, which is also probably not amazing, but it just kind of validates the need to keep doing this, to keep talking about it and educating. Was there somebody else that wanted? Yes.
When I was a colorectal surgeon in Manhattan, initially at St. Vincent's Hospital, I had a huge experience with HPV. When Gardasil came out, I had a granddaughter who was 12 years old, and I told people I wanted to get it. He had looked it up to see what a child would need that for.
Right.
It's very important to have. And why there's resistance to it, I said, well, she'll be a virgin when she gets married.
He may not be.
He may not be.
Right.
The
Exactly.
other thing I wanted to ask you more importantly, you talk about sex addiction. I was very familiar with sex addiction in the male homosexual community, where we had as many as 1,000 partners in a year and 10 in an evening in the old bash houses of town.
Right.
So you have experience in this. You're talking about the male homosexual sex addiction, or
I'm talking about male and female, both homosexual and heterosexual sex addiction. Sex addiction does not discriminate like any other disease process. There are plenty of heterosexual males who have sex addiction. There are plenty of heterosexual females that have sex addiction. This is not a male-dominated disease at all. I have a client that I worked with also for a while. She definitely had a sex addiction. And again, if you're uncomfortable with this, she would go into the bathroom every half an hour at work with a vibrator. And until she literally was in pain and bleeding and hurting herself, and then go out and, get on the prowl at night and find some guys. It was really, she was, bad shape and had no idea what was going on. She just knew she had to have this in her life. Every half hour at work, that's a lot. There's no pleasure there. She was hurting herself. Anybody else? No? Okay. Some of the patterns that we see with compulsive sexual behavior that's rooted in fantasy could be one, a compulsive use of pornography that occurs with or without masturbation, a compulsive use of one of the more digital, what we call sexnologies, webcams, sexting, dating hookup websites, virtual reality sex games, etc. Constantly being on the hunt or on the prowl for sexual activity and partners, multiple affairs or brief serial relationships, a constant involvement with strip clubs, adult bookstores, movies, theaters, clubs, and other entertainments that are completely sex focused, constant involvement with prostitutes, a pattern of anonymous or casual sexual hookup through online groups, websites, or in person, repeatedly engaging in unprotected sex. Remember, addiction is a high risk behavior. The higher the risk, the better it is for the person with the addiction. So having unprotected sex is one of the activities that sex addicts do. Repeatedly engaging in sex with potentially dangerous people. Seeking sexual experiences without regard for immediate or long-term consequences, and in some, repeated patterns of minor sexual offenses such as voyeurism, exhibitionism, and frauderism. So kind of two anecdotes. I unfortunately, I have a lot of anecdotes for this one. I am working with a sex addict. Also has a really terrible, complex trauma history as a child. Basically has been on the streets and living on his own since he was 13. Yes, a from kid, from family. Slept in cars, slept in, empty shulls, just kind of has really been on the lam. And he's married now. He has a really bad case of sex addiction, and it's taken me about 1.5 years just to get him to go to one meeting and, enter any type of treatment. So I once talked to him about it, and he told me that one of his liaisons, he was robbed at gunpoint in a hotel. And I kind of said to him, I'm like, and what happened after? He's like, I went back out the next night. I said, can you tell me about that? He said, you know what the biggest thrill is to me? I said, no, what is the biggest thrill to you? He said, the biggest thrill to me is when that knock comes at the door. Like, I have no idea who's on the other side of the door. I have no idea if I'm going to be hurt. I have no idea if I'm going to be killed. I have no idea what's happening. He's like, that's my thrill. That unknown, that high risk, that just shot of adrenaline through his body. That was the thing that got him. All right. The other one I wanted to mention is I have another client I'm working with, also a victim of a lot of trauma and childhood abuse. Yes.
Do you find the root cause of the addictions are all similar, or each type of addiction has a similar?
In my practice, it's all trauma. At this point, I kind of make my clients prove to me they haven't had trauma. I think I've had 2 clients in the entire time I've been practicing that don't come with a traumatic history. They're just trauma after trauma after trauma.
Any addiction you have to back the trauma.
We don't have to look that far. It's there.
The other thing is, do you use the 12-step program as your main?
Yeah, I do. I do. I really believe in it. There's other forms of recovery that you can do. A lot of people like smart recovery, and that's fine. And really whatever works for you. But I'm really 90+% certain you can't do it alone. Like, you can't let yourself out of jail. So I think you really do need some type of support system to get you out of addiction, and like the 12-step program, because one of the things that people with addiction do mainly is they isolate, right? They don't trust anybody. They don't want to be out in the world. And so they do their activities in isolation. If you have 75 people getting together to party and they're all high, it's still a solitary experience because you're just high in your own head and you can't really share that with anybody. So the 12-step program makes people get out there into a group, into a safe space, and they grow up in the room. The first time anybody does any type of addictive behavior, chemical or behavioral, their emotional development stops right there. So the vast majority of people with addiction are emotionally at about 12, 10, 14. That's when people usually start their addictive journeys. And they grow up in the rooms. They literally mature and learn how to listen. There's no crosstalk. So if you have 3 to 5 years as your early recovery, so your emotional 11-year-old is now kind of like a 16-year-old. And that process just helps them kind of grow into themselves in an incredibly safe environment. When I'm telling you, you don't have to dig too far. All you have to do is provide the environment. It's not all you have to do. It's hard work. You have to provide the environment, the safety, the validation, and the normalization. People come in, they are so drowning in shame that it's stunning. I tell people all the time, no matter how much you hate addicts, no matter how much you hate them, they hate themselves more. You cannot hate an addict more than they hate themselves, no matter how hard you try. They literally can't stand themselves. And that's part of the reason that they use or do these behaviors. They just can't stand being in their own skin.
What becomes your role? They're in the program. Are you the supervisor?
Well, I have my own practice and I deal a lot with addiction. About probably 90% of my practice is addiction based. The 10% is addictions that we don't know about yet based. No, I'm kidding. Yeah, that's a joke. Yeah,
Do you have any handle on the prevalence?
no,
I see. Prevalence of addiction?
no. Again, in our community, it's underreported. We don't seek treatment for a few years more than non-Jewish counterparts. By the time people seek treatment, they are in inpatient rehabs, upwards of $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a month. We like expensive rehabs. We don't really go for the other ones. No, we really do. And it's really taken there's usually a really bad reason they have to go. There's a legal implication. Financially, they're ruined. There's some disease that happened. There's an unwanted child or two. I mean, it doesn't get pretty. And then it's kind of like do or die.
But your sense is that you're seeing more of that
100%.
than other addictions?
Absolutely. Yeah, sex addiction and porn addiction, you got to, yeah, just totally. They can have other addictions with it, right? There could be alcoholism mixed in, there could be some drug use, but primarily there's, yeah, sex addiction. Yes.
You see the clients in parallel with the growth there.
Oh, yeah, it comes to me. Yeah, so treatment kind of goes into three directions. If there's medication needed, I have psychiatrists or psychiatric nurse practitioners I refer to, because there is a good percentage of clients that give them comorbidity. They're just soothing a mental health issue, depression, anxiety, bipolar. So we go for medication. Then there's individual therapy, group therapy, and then 12-step program. 12-step program is different than therapy. And when people have addiction that's bad at the beginning, we do what we call 90-90, which is 90 meetings in 90 days. Go to a meeting every single day, get a sponsor, start to work the steps. Shabbos, Yantiv, get somebody to drive you, get them on to go to a meeting. Just don't miss a meeting. When people stop going to meetings, research will show you that's when they start to slide back and relapse. It's really an important thing. One of my clients told me, I'm sorry, and this is actually really an interesting point, really lovely young man. And he was fundraising and setting up like tons of learning programs all over the tri-state and up and down the eastern seaboard. And he was working really hard, and he wasn't really doing his recovery. He kept relapsing. And he said, I don't understand why I'm relapsing. I'm doing all this work for God. I'm fundraising for all these yeshivas, starting with all these learning programs for people who don't know anything. I said, because that's not recovery. You're not going to stay sober just because you're doing that. So he started going back to meetings, and he said he went to a meeting, some little hick town that he found, and he said this guy literally drove up in his overalls and little dusty pickup truck and told him that he had been to a meeting every single day of his life for the past 33 years. And he said to me, the guy had incredible spirituality. He became his sponsor. And I was like, yeah, that's, it's an acceptance, we think too much. Recovery is not a thinking process, it's an accepting process. You just accept what you're being told and you don't overthink it. Yes.
I just want to know, you're commenting on the preponderance of sexual addiction, vis-a-vis addictions. Is that just your own practice because you become kind of specialized in your own practice in that? Or is that a global phenomenon in terms of addiction?
This course that I'm taking, this CSAT course, easily a third of the participants are Orthodox Jews or Hasidic. So I don't really know if it's just me. I know everybody who treats sex addiction is full or booked. And I think one of the reasons that we'll get into it is internet pornography, which is exploding. And there's a huge amount of that. So just like opened it up into.
But more sex addiction than opioid addiction.
No, there's tons of opioid addiction. No, 100%. But is it because it could be? I mean, I see some opioid addiction definitely, and people do definitely get their niche. And obviously, we had a huge opioid crisis in the United States. Over 100,000 people died last year from opioid overdose, for sure. But in our community, there is a huge amount of sex addiction. Yes.
What is meant by a sponsor?
So sponsor is somebody who has worked the steps already and who has a significant amount of recovery, 1 or 2 or 3 years. And then they've worked the steps with their sponsor, and then they meet with you, or you call them daily, and they work the steps with you. It's a workbook, and you work with that sponsor. If you're having an issue, you call the sponsor. The 12th step of the steps is to go out and practice the principles and give them over to other people. So you're expected to do service, right, like mitzvahs. So you get sponsees and you give them their number and they call you and they talk to you, and then you meet with them once a week for an hour, 2 hours, and you work the steps with them. So it keeps you giving, it keeps you helping other people, and it also keeps you grounded in the recovery process. I've had clients leave my therapy sessions early, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, I have to go set up the chairs in the meeting, right? It's a service. I have to go set up the coffee. I have to go open the cookies. But again, you're talking about people who are so socially, such anxiety, and now they have this purpose. They go to the meetings, they have to set up the chairs, they have to make coffee. And I don't know if you're thinking to yourself like, okay, that's not a big deal, but it is a big deal. Because for the first time in their lives, they belong somewhere. And people really want them to be there. The recovery weekend I went on, sponsored by TLR, dozens and dozens of people are covered, running around the whole place. Can we get you a chair, a drink? Can I do something for you? What can I do? Can I help you? They're just like ambassadors of goodwill, really wonderful displays of, generosity. And that's part of the program. You have to give back. Oh, yes.
Yes, you said it's exploding in our community. Do you think it's worse in the Frum community than in the general population, Jewish population? Oh, okay, okay, that's my second question. It's connected, all the Surim and the key and shit like all that might contribute to that. And anyway.
What do you mean by that?
So there's a lot of us that we're so strict about no contact before marriage. Might that contribute to sex addiction?
Sex addiction is trauma-based again. It's trauma-based and it's abuse-based, and it has to do with what happened in your early childhood. So I don't really think that would be the issue. What I do think is that we definitely need to start to have more education and talk to boys and girls. There are programs that are being put down in schools now to actually talk about sex education and things like that. What Dr. Friedman said, talking about it makes it better, not worse. Talking about it with correct biological language, terms, understanding, and then kids they're curious, right? I mean, the thing is that we are born with drives, and two of the most powerful drives we have are eating and sex. You have to eat, and you do have to have sex. It's part of human behavior, it's appropriate. And it's very interesting that sex addiction and food addiction go hand in hand, because there are two internal drives that are out of control, as opposed to a chemical or an alcohol addiction where you're taking something and putting it into your system. Right? Everybody's born with the need to eat and the need to have sex. And you really have to be careful. I have a lot of clients who will come in and tell me that their parents caught them masturbating as kids, freaked out totally, screamed and yelled and like really carried on. And that really kind of set them down this road of, associating shame with the sexual activity. Right? It's normal. Kids do it. It feels good. There's nerve endings. It's something pleasurable. And so I always tell parents, if you catch your child masturbating, very calmly, just okay, that feels good, no problem. That's a private activity. So go to your room, and when you're done, come out, wash your hands, and rejoin us. Normalize it, right? It's okay. When we get hysterical over it, then the kids react. And they know something is really wrong. And they
Do rabbis agree with you in what you're saying about it? I mean, I don't
I'm
mean.
not talking about a 6-year-old. I'm talking about a 5, 6, or 7-year-old. I'm not talking about what a teenage boy does. I'm talking about like little children.
Presumably, a teenage boy is doing it more often. Like, what is where?
But a teenage boy presumably is not doing it in the living room. I know what he's doing,
Okay,
right?
but is there any hope of talking to Rosh Hashiva? Like, it's hard for me to picture a Rebbe. It's okay, it's normal. Like, that doesn't sort of drive. I mean,
There are women that are talking about it. I work with a very religious psychiatric nurse practitioner, female, who said to me, like, if you start slamming down on everybody who masturbates, then everybody's gonna be crazy. She's like, this one guy is just beating himself up over and over and over again, and he's losing his sobriety, So you don't, SA does not allow for masturbation, SAA does. And the reason is that if you are, again, using your own self as an objectification, right, and you don't really have connect to your own sexuality, that is a problem. That is pathological. If you connect to it, SAA, which is another 12-step group, says it's okay, but SA says it's not. But I do have clients who are pretty desperate, and they feel like they really keep losing their sobriety. So then again, it becomes a matter of harm reduction and let's achieve some sobriety. That makes sense. Or not. When you talk about children and these concepts, it's really also very important to teach children the difference between secrecy and privacy. So everybody is entitled to privacy. We all have the right to have private thoughts. We all have the right to do things in private, go in the bathroom, there's private. But as we say in the program, secrets keep you sick. So we don't hold secrets. And one of the reasons we definitely want children to know that is because people who do abuse children, one of the things that they always tell them is secret and don't tell anybody. And children are very afflicted, and that's why a lot of them will not say anything, again, because it's a trusted person that's doing the abusing. So we want to tell children all the time, if somebody asks you to keep a secret, that can hurt you. So then you tell us, you're entitled to privacy, but no, secrets are not good. Okay. Patrick Carnes developed a mnemonic for how to assess if somebody has a sex addiction. Now, in the chemical addiction world, there's a mnemonic that's called CAGE. It's a simple 4-question questionnaire that we encourage practitioners to ask. And CAGE stands for, did you ever try to cut down on a substance or alcohol? A stands for angry. Does anybody ever get angry with you on the amount of substances or alcohol that you consume? G is guilty. Do you feel guilty for the amount of substances or alcohol you consume? And E stands for eye opener. You need to wake up in the morning and immediately take a drink, which then shows the practitioner that it's gone over to the point of physical dependency and they need a detox. So CAGE is just that really very short way of assessing for a chemical addiction. So Patrick Carnes developed one, and his is called SAFE. So number 1, is it a secret? Anything that can't possibly pass public scrutiny is going to create shame and a double life. A, is it abusive to yourself or others? Anything that's exploitive or harmful to others or degrades yourself will activate the addictive system. F, is it used to avoid or is it a source of not feeling painful feelings? That's the F. If sexuality is used to alter your mood and it results in painful mood shifts, then it's clearly part of the addictive process. And E, is it empty of a caring, committed relationship? Fundamental to the whole concept of addiction and recovery is to make your sexuality a healthy part of your relationship. So in the chemical addiction world, it's called CAGE, and in the sexual addiction world, it's called SAFE. I did want to mention before, the client that I'm working with, she also has a lot of tons of abuse in her background, and she doesn't have addiction, and other things we're working with. And she was at a large grocery store a couple months ago, and she felt somebody brush up against her. And that is what we call fraudinism, when somebody who does have these paraphilias kind of, you think it's an accident, but it's not. It's done purposefully. It's something that people do, let's say, on subways, crowded places. The supermarket was pretty crowded, and he brushed up against her, and she really got upset and went to get her husband. And he's like, "What do you want to do?" And she was really shaken. And she said she wants to report him. And she reported him. Came to me. She was like, "Should I have done it? Should I have done it?" I said, "Yes, you should have done it, because not only are you empowering yourself, but I'm telling you he's done this before." And she was contacted by the police in her area a few weeks later that they arrested him. He had been caught doing the same thing at the same store. We caught him on camera, and he had a record. So he was going to go into a program that either he was going to have to go to treatment or go to jail. So she was very happy, and I was very happy that she took the courage to say something and do it. And that's one of those that people just kind of like, you just kind of look like, wait, what just happened? Obviously, the touches in the sexual area, they brush against your genitals, your backside, on his chest. And it's just done in such a way that you just kind of really don't know like what just happened here. But that is not an accident. That was a purposeful act that people are doing. Okay. So what's the cycle of sex addiction? Stage 1 is what we call the triggers: shame, blame, guilt, and other strong emotions. The triggers are the catalysts that create the need or desire to act out in a sexual manner. Stage 2, fantasy. After the trigger is there, And it needs to have an escape and dissociate. So sex addicts often unconsciously turn their primary coping mechanism, sexual fantasy. How much do they enjoy their past sexual encounters? How much will they enjoy another sexual encounter now or in the future? At this point, the addict is preoccupied to the point of obsession over their sexual fantasies. What will they do? Well, now they might start flirting with a grocery store clerk that they had barely noticed before. Every person that they encounter is a potential conquest. It may involve memories that come to the surface. Step 3, ritualization. Ritualization is a very large part of the addictive process. And this is where the fantasy moves toward reality. This stage is going to add a lot of excitement and a lot of intensity and a lot of arousal. For example, the addict logs onto the computer and goes to their favorite porn site. Or maybe they're in their car and they start to cruise past where they know some sex workers hang out. Or they start the process of booking an out-of-town business trip where they can act out sexually without any repercussions. Stage 4, sexually acting out. Most non-sex addicts think that this stage is the ultimate goal of sex addiction, and this is because that's where the actual sex act and the orgasm takes place. Many are going to try to put off the actual sex and the orgasm for as long as possible, because once the orgasm happens, the high is over and you start the process all over again. And finally, the next stage, despair. Eventually, numbing will dissipate for almost all sex addicts, and when it does, many are going to start to feel very ashamed and remorseful. And that is the cycle of how people act in a sex addiction. Any questions, comments? Okay.
Is there a preponderance of men versus women? Or the other way around? What is the literature say?
So I think there are slightly more men, but there are women are playing a lot of women sex addicts also, for sure. Okay. Some of the other emotional symptoms that we look for in people that have sex addiction, again, obsessive thoughts of sex, they feel guilt, they escape or suppress their emotions, they live in shame, they have secrets, they rationalize. You know, if my wife wasn't such a fool, you know what, I wouldn't have to go out and do this. If she wouldn't be so frumpy and whatever, I wouldn't have to go out and do this. They're indifferent to their regular partners. They have anonymous sex, they disconnect intimacy from sex, and they have an absence of control in many other areas of their life. I started working with a couple that is not religious anymore. They came from a very sect of Judaism. Neither one of them is religious at this point. And he is wildly successful, and he has multiple sexual partners, and she's absolutely devastated. And we're working with her, trying to get her some support. And I said, let him come in one time, let's just talk. And he came in and I started talking to him and, you know, doing a little bit of an intake. And I said, look, I'll refer you to somebody to work with your wife and you have sex addiction. He's like, are you sure? Are you sure that it's sex addiction? I said, I'm pretty sure you have sex addiction. He's like, well, I don't really think so. I said, listen, take it. It's your best option. He said, why is this my best option? I said, because otherwise you're just a jerk who's cheating on his wife. I mean, like, take what I'm giving you like that. Then it's a different company. He's like, okay. I said, otherwise I'm just going to kill you. I said, like, this is really your best deal. And he does have sex addiction. All right. So sex addiction has much to do, again, with what happens in people's youth and attachment theory. If you work with human beings in this capacity, you know that attachment theory is very important and quite frankly begins from when the baby is born. Bowlby talked about early attachment experiences that were going to affect your personal and social life, your professional relationships, dealing with stress, your mental and physical health, and cognitive development. We now know with attachment theory, those that develop a safe attachment, an attachment that is not anxious or avoidant, can form healthy relationships and handle life's problems. A researcher named Uytun, that's Uytun et al. In 2000, If you have a secure attachment, you have a low chance of having a sex addiction because people that have secure attachments will limit their sexual activity more than those with insecure attachment. And this comes from Zach et al. In 2008. Individuals that are addicted to sex are looking for activity without the emotional relationship, and they have an anxious or avoidant attachment. Here's an interesting fact that I have found. We know that people with sex addiction objectify their partners. There is no connection, there is no intimacy, and this is anecdotal, but what I have found is they don't kiss their partners at all. Kissing is a very intimate act. I think that's why everybody goes to the movies, or listens to the songs, or reads the books, because it's literally one person with another, breathing that person in, you literally are becoming one in a very intimate way. And I always ask that question, do you like kissing? And the wives always tell me, you won't kiss me. And the husbands are like, no, it's too intimate. The act of sex is not as intimate as the act of kissing. And I'm kind of normal. I'm like, you guys just like go and make out, like hang out, I'm like never. And the women will all start crying. Why won't you? Why does it become very in that way? Because there's no attachment. That is one of the major difficulties in sex addiction, especially for the partner. The drug of choice is another human being in some way, shape, or form. That is an extremely difficult concept to integrate. And they liken the trauma of partners, and this is coming from ITAC, and of course, to really a traumatic event where the women have a lot of PTSD and really goes to kind of fight or flight situation. Not unusual for partners to, once there's disclosure, to immediately want to go and have sex with their partners. And that seems odd. I mean, your husband just told me he's been cheating on you for how many years? But what we know is that's the partner fighting. They're in the fight mode. They're fighting for their marriage. They're fighting to be the one that the husband wants, even though it's been terrible for years and they know it. But there's such a trauma in learning what they've learned that the first response is to fight. We need to fight for this. A secure attachment, this comes just from Fraley, Waller, and Brennan in 2000. You have the ability to build healthy, long-lasting relationships. If you are avoidant, you have an inability to build a healthy, long-term relationship due to an inability to engage in emotional and or physical intimacy. This may result from emotionally or physically unavailable caregivers. An insecure attachment involves codependent tendencies and the major fear of being rejected. It may result from inconsistent parenting. And an anxious, or what we call disorganized attachment, is characterized by inconsistency and an inability to trust. That can come from childhood trauma, from neglect, or from abuse. Let's talk about the two different types of sex addicts. I mentioned it to my husband. I'm going to talk about two different types of sex addicts. If he said, what, male and female? No, not male and female. We're going to talk about the two different types of sex addicts, and that is what we know today as classic or contemporary. A classic sex addict in the literature is typically an adult male with a history of abuse, insecure attachment, and impulse dysregulation, along with some typically comorbid addictions. There's concurrent mood disorders and a profound sense of personal shame and worthlessness. Addictive patterns as solutions to the classic addict's pain often progresses along developmental timelines and typically becomes increasingly entrenched over a period of years, following a typical pattern of addiction. This comes to us from Ray Miarsma and Sytsma, SYTSMA, from 2015. A contemporary sex addict. Contemporary sex addiction is the byproduct of what we call a toxic trilogy: chronicity, content, and culture. Repeated and chronic exposure to sexually graphic content that is reinforced by a highly sexualized culture will create a quote-unquote perfect storm where addictive behavior may arise. Contemporary sex addiction is uniquely positioned to harm youth, possibly setting them up for more dangerous forms of addiction. that is due to the neurobiological alteration, underdeveloped executive functioning, and impulse regulating functions. Sex addiction goes to the same place in the brain as cocaine, and I think I read somewhere that produces about 200 times the amount of dopamine that's normally found. Contemporary sex addiction has also the addictive qualities of internet pornography and been compared to that of the use of crack cocaine. It comes just related, the U.S. Senate testimony in 2004. Imaging studies of the brain show that the brain on cocaine and the brain when sexually aroused are virtually indistinguishable. The human being reacts to sex the same way it does to cocaine, one of the most highly addictive substances known to man. Comes to us from Weiss in 2015. Additionally, the internet opens the possibility of endless and varied content. Adolescents with internet addiction have a higher percentage of ADHD symptoms, depression, social phobia, and hostility than those that do not experience such an addiction. Depression, anxiety, and real-life intimacy problems are associated with chronic cybersexuality. Say researchers Reimer, Resma, and Sifma in 2015. 12% of all websites offer pornographic content. 35% of all downloads involve erotic content. Okay, I'm going to give you some other sobering statistics. No pun intended. Maybe a pun intended, I'm sure. While I'm looking for this, does anybody have a comment or question?
I had a question. You
Go
were
ahead.
saying that there's a very high correlation, as you said, between a history of trauma and addictions of various kinds.
Mhm.
I guess we hear about psychologists or counselors who like if somebody doesn't come forth with a trauma history, how hard are you pushing? And is it vital in the terms of helping them through their recovery that you work through trauma? Like, I'm assuming that's the case. If there is trauma, it has to be sort of addressed and worked through so they can get to a point of acceptance and understanding and so on and so forth. But if you don't find it, I feel like there's a bit of a fine line between, there's forced memories and memories that didn't really happen. And like, if you don't find it, where are you holding it?
And if you don't find it, then you still work with the addiction and the recovery process. I have yet to not find it. It's, people will, if you provide them the environment that they can start to talk, you'll find it. It's out there. Why would you think that it's not there?
No, there are psychologists or counselors who are not good in the sense that, we've all heard stories about people who didn't have memories and now they have memories. So are these made memories or are they real memories? Like there's a fine line between, I think, that's what, do you understand my point?
Yeah, I do understand. I do understand. Your
Like, it sounds like for the vast majority, you don't have to search too hard to find that history of trauma.
you don't.
But in the case where you don't, like,
I think it's the
can you
opposite.
let it be? It's my question.
I actually think it's the opposite. I think that people are so desperate to unload it. Finally, they're so literally aching to just tell somebody what happened. The long-term consequences or sequela of childhood sexual abuse is a profound sense of shame and guilt and fear. And they walk around with this double life constantly. They're drowning in it. They're just very, very happy to finally tell somebody what happened. So I've never had to suggest anything to anybody. It's pretty rare. Yes.
When we look at the 12-step program, we see it very based on a higher power take us out of our addiction. So is the addiction also caused not just by trauma, but by a spiritual disconnect?
Yes.
Many people have.
Yeah. So in my first talk on addiction, we actually talked about they're doing research now, what they call the paraequivocal gray area of the brain, which helps in the addictive process, but it's also where spirituality is found in the brain. So there's a connection. And since addiction is associated with trauma, and this PAG part of the brain is also mitigates fear responses, And it makes sense then if that's the spiritual center of the brain, then the spirituality is damaged. And so the 12-step program, I don't know if Bill and Bob knew that, but it addresses that part of the brain.
As a matter of fact, the founder of 12-step, Bill White, he started off using psychedelics. And that's how he had the spiritual experience, and then he developed from that the 12-step program.
How'd that work out for him?
Very good.
Finally got sober. Okay, anybody, yes,
Can I sit down while we talk about sex addict?
Yeah.
But the kids are high school kids, teenagers. So that they're not saying that people who are sex addicts, but the exposure to pornography is so great that what is the impact on them? Like what's
that's actually a really, really interesting point that you're making. It is really difficult to diagnose teenagers with sex addiction, right? But it's hard to diagnose and it's hard to treat. It's even harder to get into a treatment center program. Most programs will not take people under 18.
I'm saying that point one step below that. So as an educator, as a law, we know that the kids are being exposed to this stuff. I mean, we don't.
Are they telling you?
Yeah.
They are?
Some of them are, but some
Oh,
of
you're
them.
lucky. That's good.
That relates to all of it. But I mean, I was last once to come and talk to a whole group of boys. 8 boys about pornography and masturbation. Like, it was ridiculous to me that face because I don't want to talk to their rabbi about something that's so personal and private. So it was a disaster. But it was something that the school wanted to start having that conversation. So try and normalize the conversation. So I mean, the kids are all exposed to it, seeing it. It's a good stage when we talk about addictive behavior.
So, okay. Yeah.
Learning.
Because when right, again, so if you have a teenage guy and he's got a girlfriend and they're, having sexual activity at whatever level, and they're connected on any type of emotional level, that's not an addictive pattern. They're connected, they have an emotional connection, they're taking it to a physical level, they've got hormones that are, powerful enough to like light up the world. That's not an addictive tendency. I have worked with young adolescent males. One particular comes to mind. He is a sex addict and he's on his way. He hates women. The way he speaks about them is frightening. And he's with 2, 3, 4, 5 girls a night, literally objectifying them, mean. I mean, he was just angry and mean. And I told him, I said, you are a sex addict. You are going to be a flaming sex addict if you don't take care of this. Also heavily into alcohol. So he kind of followed that pattern. There was no connection to any of these women. He was terrible. He was talking to them behind their back, calling them names, and just really misogynistic. But yet he was with multiple girls every single night. So that to me was somebody that's definitely there. It was going to get worse. That makes sense to you?
Yeah, makes sense.
Right? Look, you have somebody, a teenage boy who's watching porn, that does not a sex addict make. You have a client of mine that was sitting in his room for 8 hours a day watching porn, that a sex addict makes. That there's no pleasure in that. There's no pleasure in laying in a dark room watching porn for 8 hours. There's, no job, terrible relationship with family, not showering, not eating. I mean, there's just no pleasure in that.
Just to speak to that, and you mentioned that there's a second category or subcategories, contemporary sexual addiction. So surely this generation, or this, let's call it this generation of people who are exposed in a very, should we say, germinal phase of their development to a lot of pornography, would that not put them in a high risk group for developing that particular variety of?
It puts them in a higher risk group, but it also puts their relationships in jeopardy. Nobody can compete with what's on pornography. Not that you want to, but I'm saying that if that's the template in your mind, right? And your first sexual experience makes a huge, like, lack of better scientific word, zing. Zing a good psychological word, like zing on your brain. Your brain's like wet cement, and it really puts a permanent template there in your brain. I mean, you don't have to get personal, nobody has to tell me, but most people do remember their first experience pretty powerfully because it's that powerful. And the problem there is that pornography is 100,000,000,000% pure fantasy. Right? I mean, not to get technical, but they shoot those scenes, God knows how many times, and what kind of lighting, and that just doesn't mimic real life. If that's your template, you're gonna be sorely disappointed. Plus, it teaches an objectification. There's zero connection between the act and the emotion. It's not relational anymore. It's selfish.
So that's theoretical, but has that been shown to be the case?
I don't have numbers for you, but I have
Or they maybe
I have people that I work with that 100%. Yeah,
Nothing was there was question. Being objective with objectification
right.
of the women. Is there a good track for him to take in terms of talking to people?
I mean, just because it was a disaster, I don't think doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it again. I think with talking to mental health professionals or people who know about sex addiction and how to broach the subject, I think it could be a really good starting point to just having kids start to talk, period. Before COVID, I was going around with Michigan University to different high schools. We were just talking about addiction, not sex addiction, just chemical addiction. And we went to several high schools and it worked out pretty well when COVID came. And after every one of the talks, a group of kids would come around me and everybody had a friend who had a problem. You know, I'm asking for my friend. I'm like, sure, tell me about your friend. Yeah, my friend has a problem. I'm like, no problem, let's talk about your friend. So the kids want to talk. I think they do. I just think you have to create and how to get on their level and talk to them about it and what it means to them and be very prepared to listen, be very prepared to not judge, you know, not squelch, not do anything. The Cusker already said you can say Lashon Hara with your nose, right? So any, you know, movement of your face or whatever will throw a kid off. Just tell me what you want to tell me. Right? Let me give you some numbers and then we're gonna kind of go for Rep, but I thought you would kind of like these numbers. So what's the cost of pornography in society? Very interesting. The cost of pornography, this is cost of $15.9 billion annually. And how do they do that? So in February 2010, the number of people using a work computer to visit sexually oriented websites was as high as 28%. By the way, upwards of 70% of pornography is viewed between the hours of 9 to 5 at work. The average visit on that pornography site on work computer took about 13 minutes. And during that month, a worker spent 1 hour and 38 minutes on each site. So if you look at data that was extracted from March 2012 from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they calculated the average hourly wage of $23.23. So if you multiply that by 1 hour and 38 minutes, you are at a loss roughly of $38 per month per employee due to pornography use in the workplace. You multiply that by 12 months, and there's a yearly cost of $456 coming from every employee who views pornography that can be estimated. Okay. Every second of the day, 28,258 users are watching pornography on the internet. $3,075.64 is being spent on pornography on the internet every second, and 372 people are typing the word adult into their search engine every day. 37 pornographic videos are being created in the United States. 2.5 billion emails containing porn are sent or received. 68 million search queries related to pornography. 25% of total searches are generated, and 116,000 queries related to child pornography are received. About 200,000 Americans are classified as porn addicts. 40 million Americans regularly visit porn sites. 35% of all internet download are related to pornography. 34% of internet users have experienced unwanted exposure to pornographic content through ads, pop-up ads, misdirected links, or emails. 1/3 of porn viewers are women. Pornography hurts teens. It increases the odds of teenage pregnancy. It hinders sexual development. It raises the risk of depression, and it creates a very distorted expectation, which will hinder a person's healthy sexual development. And finally, according to the National Coalition for the Protection of Children and Families in 2010, 47% of families in the United States reported that pornography is a problem in their home. Pornography has increased marital infidelity rate by more than 300%. 40% of people identified as sex addicts lose their spouses. 58% will suffer considerable financial loss, and 33% will lose their jobs. 68% of divorce cases involve one party meeting a new love over the internet, while 56% involve one party having an excessive interest in pornographic websites. The reason that internet pornography is such a problem is what we call the 3 A's. It's affordable, it's accessible, and it's anonymous. And it has just blown it out of the water. Anybody can get a phone. Any kid can go get a phone. Anybody can get a phone for a month and then just destroy it. I was working with a Basiaco girl who did not have a smartphone. Her parents would let her have a smartphone. She had a basic phone that you could call, text, and pictures. And she was sexting with some 50-year-old guy out in California. And yeah, her parents were obviously considerably upset. And you know, she didn't think it was dangerous. He was out there. I mean, he said he was, you know, out in California. Who knew where he was or who knew, you know, what he was doing. What? I'm sorry? Oh, no. Yeah, and she was having a sexting relationship with him.
So that texting,
Sexting.
what is sexting?
Oh, sexting, nude pictures, nude pictures of, you know, performing sexual activity on your cell phone, sending it across the, you know, the internet. So
What are kosher phones? I thought they.
because a lot of kosher phones you can still take pictures on. You don't get internet access, but you can. My daughter, who's in Lakewood, has a kosher phone, and I can send her pictures. They might upload slower, but you can get pictures. Right. So, difficult topic. I think it's an important topic. I do believe that, as per our rabbi and educator here, it's really imperative, like Dr. Friedman said, for the schools to start to address it, to get trained, to talk about it. It's happening all over. I don't think it's going anywhere. And I think, again, just respectful dialogue that teaches individuals what it is, that teaches individuals the concept of what healthy sexuality is, to have a partner, to have emotion involved with it, to feel good about it in both directions. It's going to go a long way. So, thank you. Any further questions, comments? Yes.
I was just wondering, you know, I'm very interested in talking about your experience as a therapist. How successful, again, in terms of helping people, not only overcome the sexual addiction, but finding sort of a healthy way to function? Is it something that you've seen a lot of success with?
So success is a great question when you talk about addictive work, because it is something that, right, has relapse and recovery. So it really depends on how you define success. But do I work with couples who have both gotten into recovery and their marriages are really solid now? Yeah, absolutely. Does it take time? Yeah, easily 5 years, easily 5 years. But once they get into recovery, I mean, they're in great places. They have babies, they, you know, they'll remarry each other, ceremony, they'll do something to recommit their relationship. I mean, it can be really, I'll just start crying. It can be really, very beautiful, and they deserve it. I mean, they don't have to go to hell and back.
It sounds like the stuff you do is very gratifying for you.
And I do, I love it. I did work with one couple, that came every Friday for 3 years. I was renting an office at that building, it was a really nice building. It was a really beautiful building. And every Friday, it was screaming. My office manager would run down the hall every Friday, be like, "Do I call the police?" I'm like, "We're good." And that was with the noise machine. I mean, but you know what? Screaming is just pain. It's pain being let out. And the therapeutic room is to allow for pain to be let out and absorbed. And they're doing amazing. I mean, amazing. And they're definitely a success story. Yes. It's tough for the person that has the addiction. Their self-worth really plummets, and their shame and all that comes back. For the partner, they're angry. There's a lot of anger. So, yeah, you can kind of have to start in the beginning a little bit, yes. Yes,
How should a parent, what should a parent do if he or she finds a 16-year-old boy who's watching porn? What should his response be?
what would you like to do? It's great to have therapists who already know that.
What's the outgoing response?
Talk. Talk without shame, I understand. Sex is a great thing. You know, explain the danger of it, a lot of these sites can lead you to children's sites, like that, right? Let's just talk about being safe. Of course, you want to watch porn, it's interesting, it's exciting. What does it do for you? And just keep them safe. Keep them safe from predators that are online and from, you know, sites that would lead to child pornography, which there are people monitoring those sites all the time, even if it's an accidental download, you're in trouble. I had a client who accidentally he really did not have any desire for any type of sexual encounter with children. He accidentally downloaded the site. It was not good. He didn't end up in prison. He got out of it, but it was scary. Talking involves parents getting over their own discomfort. Once the parent is comfortable, it should be, you talk to your kids about any other thing that has to do with safety, right? Let me get to it, yes.
What do you suggest we read to find out more about that? And you mentioned the three references.
Well, Out of the Shadows by Patrick Carnes is a great book. It's kind of an original. What? Out of the Shadows? On Amazon. Oh. Sex Addiction 101, the one I'm kind of pouring through now by Robert Weiss, is very easy book to read. Amazon has a lot of Patrick Carnes stuff. I wrote a lot of stuff on Amazon. Yeah.
It's just, at least in Canada, it was hard to find that one.
Oh.
The other ones, no problem.
Okay. Yeah. Yes. Do that. Yeah.
The observant community, what's the most prevalent sexual type of addictions? Pornography, is it porn? And then what would be second and third?
We have the same taste as anybody else. Prostitutes, strip clubs, BDSM. We like what other people like. But I think porn is very prevalent. Yes.
I'm trying to understand your response about the teenagers to play it out. I mean, I'm not disagreeing. But you've highlighted all the dangers of pornography. You find your 16-year-old watching pornography. There's certain intuition which says you want to keep them away from it.
You're not going to be kept away from it.
No, but I get that. I get that response. But then are we just feeding into
No, you're educating.
Well, what's the message?
That sex should be a beautiful thing, should be something that two people are connected. One day you're gonna find a partner, you're gonna have sex, you're gonna love that person very much, it's an expression of love. We talk about it, this makes women being objects, there's no emotion attached to it, people are being hurt. This could also lead you to sites that are gonna be very dangerous for you, right? That's like telling me that if you ban alcohol from your house, your child's not gonna find out.
I'm just trying to, because you are though inevitably, not encouraging by any means,
It's not
but
encouraging.
that's what I'm trying to figure out. Do you think I'll discourage or you just don't think it'll be more helpful?
If you take your child and sit them down and say, hey, let's watch some porn together, then I'll recommend.
Yeah,
That's an encouragement.
right.
If you simply understand it as a fact of life, we are sexual beings. We are, right? What does the Gemara say?
Yeah.
Took away the sex drive, chickens run away eggs. This is how we have been made. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing. It's not encouraging. If anything, it's going to keep your child safer because they will be able to talk to you, right? I mean, my poor kids, they're married to a social worker, so this is being reported, but whatever. One of my kids loves to do this to me. I call them up, I'm like, hey, where are you? Oh, a white van, it's not a puppy, is that okay with you? Okay, really, where are you? He's like, oh, Andy is candy, I'm going, bye. Children torture therapists. No, it's like, but we want. Well, I'm gonna talk about this with Dr. Freeman, talk about resilience in children. You want your children to call you at 2 o'clock in the morning if they're in trouble. You want them to come to you if they get pregnant. You want them to come to you. This is a different world. And, you know, when I grew up in Newtown in Detroit in the 70s, if your parents said, "I'm gonna kick you out of the house," that was a real threat. Today, that's not a threat. There are a million organizations that are happy to take your child. There are a million people in apartments where your child can couch surf, and there's a real network out there for your kids, and you're gonna lose your kids. And that's your choice. So I'm all for just talk. Just like talking about suicide doesn't encourage children to commit suicide, talking about pornography doesn't encourage them to, if anything, it destigmatizes, takes the shame away. They don't understand. What is this that's going on? And it really gives you a really good opportunity to talk about not being violent or misogynistic or objectifying to people of any type. Because what they find is that people that also have, let's say, behavioral addictions, that spills over to their work life and to doing things that are not right. There's a basic disregard for human feeling.
And I'm missing the link though now between the contemporary version and trauma here, because.
Yes, I found it.
The contemporary version doesn't necessarily have a trauma base.
Oh,
The
okay.
contemporary version is just, there's, doesn't, it, you know, it can be, what do they call them, like the games, a lot of the games have, the cartoon, I don't say any of these things, but the games have a lot of sexual, violent content. And that can be a segue into it. Right, it's just all over. And then you can have pop-up sites and things that come down, right? Yes.
Would you care to share any of the specifics of the screaming therapies?
You want me to demonstrate it or not? You know, there's a lot of addiction in there. And they both have major trauma backgrounds. And it doesn't have to really take much to trigger people when they're in that kind of vulnerable state. It could be anything from you didn't buy milk to, you know, who gets up with the baby or who picks up the dust ball from under the table. It's not the thing that's happening, it's the pain that is bringing up that comes in. Because they're shrieking at each other. I don't know how else to tell you. I mean, there's a lot of pillows in the office and they're going at it. They're, you know, just crying, they're screaming, they're using a box of tissues, they're in pain. This is a disease. Disease hurts. Yes.
There's another thing, the Judaism of masturbation is a huge issue, it's quite profound. But also that creates an incredible amount of guilt in the particular with the boys. I had to deal with the man in his 30s. And he felt he was the only person in his world, that was and because and then he goes and reads all the story, and I said to him, you gotta stay away from him, and then they're crazy. So I suppose the question is, how do we educate the boys when they know the story not saying this is us, this is the God versus the reality, and psychologists saying for investigate because the trauma of the act can have the effects of the
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, but I'm gonna kind of tell you like this. Do you really know who's doing what? I mean, do you have an accurate read? The answer is you don't. You don't know that the boy who absolutely is not and won't and, you know, is not masturbating in his room. You have zero idea of what's happening. My gut feeling is more boys are doing it than anybody would ever be aware of. Somebody who compulsively masturbates also has addiction. There's no pleasure in compulsively masturbating to eating or hurting yourself, which doesn't hurt. And that's the case, then yeah, that person is treated. There's no pleasure there. There is a cycle of guilt, and shame, and upset that's just feeding it over and over and over again.
But I know you mentioned therapists, and the therapist being non-religious, not Jewish, couldn't understand where his pain was coming from.
You know, I have to say, it's interesting, through this program that I'm taking, there are a lot of Christian groups that have treatment centers. I'm learning really a huge amount of people with other religions that really have the same kind of somewhat similar philosophies that we do, and they're educating their pastors and their priests and people in their communities. I'm in supervision with this lovely couple from Mississippi. love their accent, and they're working with people within their community, and it's not true. There are other communities that really are grappling with the same things that we are. And they're trying also to bring programming and awareness and educate their clergy. Same thing. This is not an us problem. This is a world problem. Yes.
My question is, you mentioned your room, sitting in the room today. Today, with the movies and everything going out and helping our children infected. You have to go from movement, but trying to teach children, and they call it education, when they don't have that. Everybody's down.
I can't answer that. I don't know. I just know you have to work with what you know. This is where we are. Right? And I think that I do believe that the Torah can solve everything for us, where we can give us the guideline for how to work with this. We're an incredibly compassionate religion. I think we understand mental health in our religion, what any other religion does. And so I believe that we have, ways to deal with it. You're not going to change, the world movement, or it's not going to be anytime soon.
That's their argument, to teach the children that all this is normal.
But you're not introducing the concepts to them. You're simply talking to them about concepts that they may know already.
Yeah, the outside world, that's all, that's just.
100%. Yeah, the only thing that I'm proposing is always have open, respectful, trustful dialogue. No matter what it is. That's- Okay, Herr Shabbos, thank you guys very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, really, very powerful, and, serious one, really, totally ignorant. Okay, 6 o'clock. 6 o'clock, Dr. Friedman here and Dr. Schlein. It's at 6:15. And I think there's still a little bit of in my story about thank you, but I don't think you'll find out.